Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. When the brief from Jack Smith, the 165-page magnum opus, was suddenly published last week, people poured through it intensively to get all the nuggets of new information and bombshells, of which there were a few dozen in there. And you had a race of real focus to the big points in the brief. And then, since then, interestingly enough, because people have been waiting for this evidence in one form or another, including a trial, there hasn't been that much of a second look. And that's what I wanted to do today. Have a little bit of a survey of some important points that were maybe missed in the first time around, as people, including me, were very quickly foraging. And to do it, we have really the perfect person, Marcy Wheeler, known to many of you, but she's long been known by the handle Empty Wheel. She's an independent journalist specializing in national security and civil liberties. She writes at her blog, Empty Wheel, publishes in many outlets, including Motherboard, The New Republic, and Al Jazeera, and appears frequently on TV and radio, and is the author of Anatomy of Deceit, a primer on the CIA leak investigation. But above all those things, she is particularly, I think, meticulous, thorough, a dogged, almost forensic investigator. And so the perfect person to just ask about what else is out there besides the big headline items that we already knew. So, Marcy Wheeler, thanks very much for joining.
Really great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I have a couple, I think, items that have been underreported, but let's start with you. You've given a pretty in-depth deep dive on this document. What are some of the items that seem to have not gotten all the attention they deserve the way things unfolded?
I think the way in which Steve Bannon is included, right? So Steve Bannon wasn't in either the original indictment or the superseding indictment. We actually hadn't heard from him at all. And then all of a sudden he shows up somewhere between 10 and 15 times in the brief. Now, people can go to the New York Times. Alan Foyer and Charlie Savage did a good description of the kinds of ways he shows up. But to my mind, one of the most important things about it is he is described right from the start as a co-conspirator. So we're used to, like, when we first got the indictment, there were 6 co-conspirators, Rudy Giuliani and a bunch of other people. The superseding indictment was largely about getting rid of Jeffrey Clark because John Roberts said they had to. And they didn't shift around the numbers.
Let me I'll just quickly interrupt. Most of our listeners know that, but Jeff Clark was the man who would be king at the DOJ. And all those interactions, the Supreme Court said, would be core duties, thinking about investigating anybody. And so the superseding indictment just excised that whole chapter of one of sort of 6 from the narrative.
And so what we saw with the superseding indictment was, as you said, we just get rid of everything having to do with Jeffrey Clark, anyone at DOJ, almost all of Trump's White House aides, conversations with Bill Barr, all of those go because John Roberts says that's what you need to exclude. They did a couple of other things with the indictment. They shored up, given the Fisher opinion from the Supreme Court, the limitation of obstruction, 18 U.S.C. 1512c2, to something having to do with documentary, evidentiary impairment. So they shifted the focus slightly on the vote certifications, which is something we're seeing in the crime scene people as well. They're trying to sustain 13 cases so far from crime scene people who have been charged with obstruction. And that's always going to be about these certifications. And in Trump's case, it's a lot easier to sustain that because of the fake electors, right? So we know he was involved in that. And so you can say he was trying to impair the evidence about who actually won the election.
During the oral argument for that case, which people were somewhat anticipating the Supreme Court would reverse, Fisher being one of the many marauders that day, they had a very fine-grained argument about statutory interpretation. But there was, at the oral argument by Justice Jackson, a suggestion, look, even under this, the interpretation the majority is seems to be going for and did eventually embrace. What it means is you have to impair evidence. Now, the paradigm of that would be taking a piece of paper to the shredder or Sandy Berger sticking it in his pocket. But the theory here, because Marcy, you did say it's straightforward, but there's going to be a fight, is that in his conspiratorial activities, Trump was looking to impair the integrity of evidence. What evidence? The actual genuine elector certificates, and those he was trying to impair, even though he didn't touch them. But there will be perhaps a fight when it comes back to the Supreme Court, possibly. And Jack Smith will have an ally there, it appears, in Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who seemed open to that
Amenable,
suggestion and thought that the Fisher majority had gone too far.
Well, we're going to see on the Fisher stuff that crime scene people will probably go back up to the Supreme Court before Trump on that as
That's
well,
a good point,
for the same reason. And so just as one example, there's a crime scene guy, Matthew Loganbill. I think it's before Amy Berman Jackson. And they're trying to sustain the charges against him because in December, he said, I want to burn the voter certifications. And he got into the Senate to actually, that's what he was trying to do. I want to burn the vote certifications. So they're generally only trying to preserve the case with people who knew about not just the vote certification, but the certificates themselves. And when they got inside, rushed to go do something about it. I suspect that they're trying to preserve a couple of crime scene cases that they would like to use against Trump as well. Loganbill is somebody who his only felony, I think, was obstruction. So they're making the effort with him, but also because he's somebody who obviously was thinking about the certificates long before he broke into the Capitol that day. So that's just an example of where that argument's going to go.
So you've cited some pretty big stuff here, Bannon, and we'll get back to him in a moment, the sort of shoring up of the A2 claim, especially as it might relate to Trump, and that in other cases among the 1,000 or more that the DOJ is investigating.
And then the third one is they talk repeatedly about Mike Pence being Trump's. They say he's got two roles. He's the president of the Senate and he is Trump's running mate. And so one of the things in the brief that they want to bring in is discussions Mike Pence had with Trump about being his running mate. And they really lay into that hard. My impression, although I'm sure Trump's lawyers don't agree with me, but my impression is they do a better job at preserving the Pence argument than, for example, Eric Hirschman, who he's listed as person 9 in the brief. As he was in the January 6th committee reports, he was absolutely important for being somebody right at the core of all of these fights. The brief describes him as kind of the liaison with the campaign. And if they lose Eric Hirschman's testimony, his losing that might be as fatal as losing Mike Pence.
Yeah, and Hirschman, of course, is, as you say, is in this category of official White House counsels, and they excise much of it, but not all of those. They keep a few. And what was your sense, Marcy, that Pence is the biggest example, Hirschman's the other? They get rid of Clark because they sort of have to. The stuff with Pence and others, it's obviously going to be a real fight, the real fight. Do you think it's just their conclusion? We just really can't do without this evidence. We have to roll the dice on it? Or do you think they feel confident of the non-immunity argument that they made?
Well, in my opinion, and I invite you to totally disagree with me, but in my opinion, the immunity ruling from Roberts sort of dodged whether he bought Blasingame.
And can you flesh that out a little?
Yeah. So Blasingame is the opinion from the D.C. Circuit that has not yet gone to the Supreme Court on whether or not Trump can be sued civilly. And the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, for example, are also being sued. And so that opinion at the D.C. Circuit, written by Sri Srinivasan, largely picked up what Amit Mehta said. Mehta, of course, presided over the Oath Keepers cases and a bunch of the most violent assault defendants. But they both argued that the Constitution doesn't care about who becomes president. So you, as candidate for re-election, the incumbent president, in his role as candidate, is not entitled to presidential immunity at all. That is what the Blasingame held. And Roberts really dodged whether he bought that. He didn't invoke it. He didn't say, I rely on this. in treating some of the things that he vaguely knew about, didn't say, of course, this is campaign. If he decides he doesn't like Blasingame, and of course, Blasingame may go back before Supreme Court before this does, but if he doesn't buy that holding from Blasingame, and this matters especially in Trump's conversations with people in the states, right? The president has no role in counting the vote in states. And much of that remains in the document. Much of that is, we're going to call people in Arizona and harangue them about counting more votes. And Roberts seemed to nod to say the president under take care clause has an interest in making sure that the election is conducted fairly. Now, one of the things that Jack Smith did in his brief, which I thought was almost humorous after a while, was say, you don't call the House leader in Arizona to do something about the vote because he's not involved. Doug Ducey's not involved. Why didn't you call the same people in Michigan? You talked to Mike Shirkey in Michigan instead of talking to Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, who's in charge of overseeing the vote count. And so they really get into distinguishing, you weren't calling the people who you would call if you cared about the vote, except in Georgia, because those people were Republicans. And you never raised any concerns about all the Republicans who also got elected in the same elections that you said were fraudulent. So there's this interesting logical argument about who he was calling. But the larger argument is in that role, he is doing that as a candidate. And so as a candidate under Blasingame, but not necessarily under the immunity ruling, as a candidate, that's not entitled to any kind of immunity at all. And so that's the base level assumption that goes into Jack Smith. If John Roberts doesn't buy that on the next go around, they're going to throw it out entirely, because that is where a lot of this comes in, including, as I said, a lot of the, there are conversations with Mike Pence where they're saying this is Donald Trump talking to his running mate.
Yeah. And, on that, I want to talk about each of your 3 points because I think they are all really important and trenchant, and they were kind of on my bingo card as well. One quick point about where Roberts will be on the DC Circuit and Blasingame is to just note we have one other, piece of evidence here, which is, and I can just say, Marcy, this might be more up my alley than yours because I clerked up there, but it is stunning that that memo from him leaked and that it had a really scathing treatment of the DC Circuit immunity opinion, which I think most of us thought was fairly solid, bipartisan, thorough, and he just savaged it. So it might certainly indicates he won't be afraid to go the other way. Just a few sort of follow-on comments about each of those points. Bannon, it's really, you're right, he appears at the very end as, along with Giuliani, the kind of impresario here. Trump, a general theme is kicking out everybody who won't tell him what he wants to know. But Bannon makes that comment in his podcast about how hell's going to break loose or whatever he says. And we now know that wasn't casual, but really was the product of not just consultation, but maybe even direction on his part with the president. Fair enough?
Yeah, I think to my mind, and this is, I invite you to explain this because you'll do it better than me, is it's not just that Bannon's all over the document, it's that he is treated as a co-conspirator, meaning they want to and expect to rely on a hearsay exception to be able to introduce some comments that Bannon made. And if you look very closely, some of the things that show up in there from Bannon, which were new. So, for example, Bannon tells Boris Epshteyn, Trump is going to fire his real campaign team and put Rudy in charge, and you're going to report to Rudy. And Bannon knew that before anybody else.
That's right.
But those are Boris Epshteyn texts. So they could come in that way because Epshteyn is being treated as co-conspirator 6.
And by the way, I should also add about your point of a candidate. That is the recasting of the whole thing, right? Paragraph 1 had said Donald Trump was president of the United States and now says he was a candidate in 2020 and he lost. Just very quickly on the evidence points, there are 2 big exceptions. And you're saying that's going to be any statement that Trump made, as you probably know, is defined under the rules as non-hearsay. So if Cassidy Hutchinson said, I heard Trump say X, Cassidy says, Trump says would seem like hearsay, but in fact, that's admissible. And likewise, any statement by a co-conspirator in furtherance of the conspiracy is also coming in. So we don't have to have an evidence exam for the listeners here, but just know that this is a granular treatment in 165 pages. And at every statement, they've not only considered what is the defense to immunity, but also how are we getting this in? This is our trial. This is what we're going to present. So I just think the theme with Bannon was really important, and it's part and parcel of he's not talking with Epstein or, certainly not Cipollone or Philbin, but the real team crazy is in charge. Then second, I just want to say the state stuff, I think, is the main area that's not just recast, but bulked up. So we now see Trump as actually having a driving sort of impresario role in this state stuff. They take away everything from DOJ, and that's the one thing they enhance. And there are 6 of them, and they go through it, maybe the longest part of the brief. I didn't know before, I don't know if you did, there was a call to the Pennsylvania delegation that he is overhearing. And just in general, he's taking a much more active role. And then finally on Pence, this is the thing I noticed most because I had anticipated, others had, that this is really where it's going to be. And to kind of give a hypothetical answer to the question I posed to you, Marcy, recently, I thought they had just decided, okay, we'll do without Clark. Okay, we'll recast the White House counsel, but we got to have Pence. In any event, it could be a year or more, right, of going up and down. They hope only once, but with Pence, but they're ready to pay that. And we all saw immediately that the special counsel took a hint from Roberts to say anytime the vice president has a constitutional role with the Senate and he opens the envelopes, it's not at all what Trump or Eastman or Chesbrough thought, but there's a role. Anytime they're talking about that might be official, as the Supreme Court said, but isn't immune because the analysis goes, infringe on the authority and functions of the executive branch because this is Pence acting in that role. I'll just say, but let me ask you your opinion on this, and then I want to come back to something else on Pence. It ain't obvious, right? I mean, the fact that in some ways they are contemplating what his role and how he would handle it, private lunches, 3 of them, conversations off the Oval Office, Trump talking to his vice president, second in command. The mere fact that the subject matter has to do with Pence's role in the Senate, to me, is not going to automatically bring it home. Do you have thoughts?
I think they do 2 things. One is there's this famous footnote 3 in the immunity decision, which Anna Bowers wrote a super great, long, deep post on if people want to read about it. But it basically, Amy Coney Barrett is like, I agree with most of this opinion, except how are we going to prosecute bribery? Because you need evidence. Like the Roberts opinion basically says you can't use official acts at all. You have to throw them out, which is what...
Even as evidence, right.
Yeah. And Amy Coney Barrett says, well, you need to be able to, because otherwise, how are you going to ever prosecute bribery? And so in this weird footnote that no one has been able to make sense of, Roberts is like, well, you can use stuff that's in the public record. And I'm not claiming that I can make sense of that any better than anyone else. Go read the Anna Bowers thing. But one of the things they do all through their discussion of Pence's conversations with Trump is they also cite his memoir. And so one of the things they're saying...
Pence's memoir.
Yeah, Pence's memoirs. One of the things they're saying is Pence chose to make this public. He chose to make this public irrespective of executive privilege, irrespective of the role that he played. I mean, some of the other stuff in the memoir probably is official acts, but Pence chose to make this public. And so would that get you to a footnote 3 exception for Pence? I have no idea, but I suspect, they don't mention footnote 3 at all in the brief, in the immunity filing. But, I suspect one of the reasons they do carry out that parallel citation is to show for, I'd say, about 75% of the claims, they're not relying just on Pence's testimony. They're also relying on stuff that he put in his book.
Yeah. And I just want to say this part of the Supreme Court opinion, which is there's just no way around it being a little elliptical. But this part about Pence, it's official because they're talking, but it may be overcome, is particularly Delphic. And it's going to fall to Chutkan to try to adjudicate in the first instance, knowing that, the soft hammer of the DC Circuit is above her, and they're worried about the Supreme Court, and the big hammer of the Supreme Court is there, and she's got to do her best. But even leaving aside, right, wrong, politics, et cetera, it's just damn hard to figure out what the hell they're saying, especially here.
And I would imagine that the audience of this is Supreme Court, which is why, by the way, I'm just puzzled that they described the Brooks Brothers riot as a violent riot or whatever they did. The Brooks Brothers riot, people may remember, in 2000, there's vote counting going on in Florida, and Roger Stone and some other people organize a bunch of people in Oxford shirts to try and threaten the vote count.
Rent a mob, it was called at
Rent
the time.
A mob, right. But it's called the Brooks Brothers riot because everyone was nicely dressed. And
good Republicans.
It was the model for, and they even described this, Mike Roman at the TCF Counting Center in Detroit.
We're now back in 2020. Yeah, okay.
Now in 2020, one of the Michigan-based lawyers was like, things are getting a little wild here at the TCF Counting Center. And Roman was like, great. Cause a riot.
Let them riot.
Let them riot. Yeah. They invoke, and we learned that in December, by the way, which tells you interesting things about ongoing investigations. But for many people, it was new. And they include this description of the Brooks Brother riot as something violent. And I was like, how are the three justices on the Supreme Court, Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, going to feel about the description? Because that puts them in the position of the wacky lawyer. It puts them in...
They having all worked on the 2000...
They're in the Eastman role, basically.
Yeah,
they're the ones saying, you have to count the way George W. Bush wants you to count.
As lawyers, we should
As lawyers.
emphasize,
they're the lawyers, not the rioters, but they're just in the same role that Eastman or Chesborough are, which is they're making these crazy, or frankly, Rudy Giuliani. And I'm stunned by that, because I think that, wouldn't that give you some hostility among the three justices? You might try to be, obviously you're trying to peel off Amy Coney Barrett, and the two most likely are Kavanaugh or Roberts. And you then remind them that in 2000, they were in the Eastman Rudy Giuliani role.
Although when you say that, I'm put in mind of the line, history repeats itself. The first time is tragedy. The second time is farce. Because when you imagine Roberts, Kavanaugh, whatever, in 2020, and James Baker running the show, and now you have, that's in 2000, and now you have in 2020, Rudy Giuliani, I guess, or Cannon in the Baker role, and these total team crazy, now disbarred lawyers, the only ones left on the street playing the roles by the previous justices.
So I think they're doing two things with Pence. One is they're trying to make an argument about these two roles that Pence plays. They're trying to make an argument to the footnote 3. But the other thing I think they're trying to do, again, trying to peel off two justices, Amy Coney Barrett and one other person, is to, in the discussions about immunity, the hypothetical was, could Joe Biden order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate Donald Trump? Right? As president, he could do that. Would he have immunity? And the justices tried to avoid that inconvenient hypothetical. But where you get to with Pence is, could Donald Trump effectively get Mike Pence assassinated? Effectively try to get Mike Pence. And one of the things they've added, and this is, I think, a dirty little dodge, this I don't think will survive. They quote what is understood to be Nick Luna, who was Trump's body man turned in charge of something. And as soon as he learns that the Secret Service has rushed Mike Pence out from the Senate to a secure location to protect him from this mob of people shouting, "Hang Mike Pence," he rushes in, tells Trump, and Trump says, "So what?" Trump says, as the vice president, as people are screaming, "Hang Mike Pence," so what? Now, they're not trying to introduce that Nick Luna comment. They're saying, we're just doing this to contextualize the famous tweet where, as this mob was overtaking the Capitol, Trump by himself, sitting in the dining room without help from any of his aides, tweets out, Mike Pence didn't have the courage, which did inflame the mob and did really put Pence at risk for being assassinated. And they include this Nick Luna thing to get to Trump's motive.
Which is, by the way, a perfectly proper theory of admissibility, context of an otherwise admissible statement.
But it's an official, it's like Nick Luna goes to him to say, do something as commander-in-chief to protect Mike Pence. And Donald Trump, as somebody who's trying to steal an election, says, so what? Screw Mike Pence. And so I don't know how that's going to work, but I do think that one of the things they're trying to do as this goes back is to point to the absurdity and really just the grotesque implications of this, which is that the president of the United States can have executed another constitutionally elected officer, who, by the way, is also immune, with complete immunity. And so that's my take on what they try to do with Mike Pence, which is that when it goes back, somebody at the Supreme Court, in addition to Amy Coney Barrett, is going to say, this is beyond the pale. And by then, if it gets back, right, it's not going to go back if Donald Trump wins the election. It's only going to go back if Donald Trump loses. And so already there's going to be, I think, less inclination to do something extremist, because at that point, you're not protecting Donald Trump anymore, unless he, of course, launches another.
Of course, they say they were writing for the ages, protecting future presidents, but that seems hard to believe. But just to your point, there is one thing in there that we've always sort of inferred, but they now are alleging as part of their evidence that struck me. It's on page 75, and the citation is only to the video of the speech on the elites. But here's what they say. When the defendant took the stage to speak to supporters, he knew that Pence had refused once and for all to use the fraudulent elector certificates. He also knew he had only one last hope to prevent the certification, the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, he delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters. And in particular, and this really is just odious, he knows Pence isn't going there. And he doesn't say, Pence is terrible, he betrayed us. He said, if Pence comes through, we'll be okay. Knowing that they will learn shortly that he won't come through, and their last hopes are crushed, and they will be, murderous with rage. I mean, that really is pretty close to, trying to get him off. And that seemed implicit before, but now they're going back to what he knew and when he knew it. And to me, that's a big point about Pence that people haven't seen. And then something else, and you touched on it, Marcy, is that there's going to be a real fight, an interesting one, about deference. So the court says context is really going to matter and all these things. And we have oodles of context here. For instance, what you just said, the context of telling him about Pence by an official actor, et cetera. Now, typically one defers to a district court's factual determination, but the reason for it is the district court is there, observes the witnesses and the like. We are still sort of at the allegation stage. It's all on paper. And the question really will be for the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. You can imagine an aggressive court saying, we don't have to defer to this. We can read the blank pages as well as anyone else. And she says, accepts Smith's view that this is based on context where we are, but we don't. So that would be a sort of huge tussle ahead. The other point I just wanted to make about Pence is, in keeping with this being a very granular and detailed statement by statement exposition, he's got Smith alternate theories on Pence. Everyone mentions the one about the Senate, as you did. No one except you does mention the point about they're just acting as candidates. I think it's true that we do have statements in the law about a candidate. The Constitution is indifferent who the president is. So if you're really a candidate, that doesn't matter. But are they candidates when they're, that'll be a real question. And then there's sort of belt suspenders and what do you have in Ireland? What's the third way to hold pants up? But
I wouldn't know what they're called. I can't even say the word Lori properly. So.
Braces. Anyway.
That's right. That's it. Braces, I think.
Yeah. the point about certain conversations being private because that go to Pence because Trump orders the White House counsel out of the room. And what could be an easier demonstration, says Jack Smith. So the overall point to make, and you made it generally, is they are hedging their bets. And if the Supreme Court really wants to strip Pence completely from this indictment when it comes back to them, they're going to have more work to do than simply refuting the Article 2 theory of his role there. They're going to have to make the kind of fine-grained factual decisions about clear error or whatever that typically they don't do. And typically what they do is let that smaller stuff pass. But in that case, Smith could be left with, even after an aggressive Supreme Court ruling against him, 2, 3, statements by Pence. And there's also the book theory and maybe stuff by a lawyer or two, et cetera. So I think on this all important focus, they are hedging their bets.
There are two other weak parts, though. One is, I told you about the tweet. 224, he sends out the tweet. Mike Pence didn't have. And they did incredible work with tweets, but they also plan to rely on Dan Scavino's testimony. And this is, I think, one of two weak points in this argument. Dan Scavino is a White House employee. They describe vaguely that he was also volunteering on the campaign. They say that Scavino never really distinguished whether he was writing tweets for the campaign or for the White House. They say, some tweets were RT'd onto the POTUS Twitter account and some were not. And in fact, one of the most important reasons why they went to Twitter to get his content was not for the DMs, which is what everyone focuses on. They wanted to make sure that they could attribute, they wanted to make sure who was basically holding the loaded gun. They wanted to make sure that they had proof that only Trump and Dan Scavino had access to the account. They wanted to make sure there were no other accounts coming in and logging in and sending tweets out. They wanted to put literally the loaded gun aiming at Mike Pence in Donald Trump's hands, sitting alone in that dining room. Now, they're relying on
I get the nerd former evidence professor in me just can't resist saying there's such a thing called an adoptive admission, which if Trump lets Scavino write these things and sees it and doesn't do anything, that itself would have the status in the evidence code of an admission, same as if Trump had made it. Sorry, I couldn't hold back. Go ahead.
But then you get into, and I think one of the things they do, and then I'll get into the other second weak point, is they try and strip out any White House assistants with tweets, comments by Trump, because then they become official. So, for example, there are some tweets he sent out later where he was Commander-in-Chief, go home, be peaceful. They're like, these, we think they're not official anyway, but we're not going to rely on them. We're only going to rely on this Mike Pence tweet. But they still are relying on Dan Scavino being in this sort of hybrid role. And I expect Trump's lawyers to go right after and claim that Scavino was the deputy chief of staff, right? So that's official. How can you kind of hybridize Dan Scavino? The one other place where I think they've got a big hole is Stephen Miller, who is not mentioned at all in this entire document. But of course, if you read the January 6th committee report, is the one who makes the last edits. So the attacks on Pence are in the speech. The attacks on Pence are taken out, it sounds like, based on Eric Hirschman's intervention. And then after Pence says, no, I'm not going to help you, they put those attacks back in. And they say in there, almost all of the work on the speech was done on people's private emails, but not the last edits. And the last edits would have been Stephen Miller's. And you can see how Trump's lawyers are going to be like, well, this was Trump's official speechwriter changing the speech on his White House account at the last minute. And, this is, so that's another little area of wiggle room where they just don't, in fact, maybe they use the passive voice, which is a big glaring sign, that I think he says Trump ordered the speech to be changed, but the people who did the change are White House people, and they just don't do the kind of analysis they do with Eric Hirschman and Dan Scavino. And so I think that that's another area where Trump's lawyers are going to really attack this.
Marcy Wheeler, I suspect a large fraction of our audience hasn't accompanied us all the way here, but the ones who have This has been just, not just a really valuable deep dive, but one that I think just isn't out there, which I got to say is part of your trademark. So thanks very much. I hope you'll come back, and I hope those that are here really appreciate and bring home these really detailed points, because that's what things are going to turn on in front of Chutkan thereafter in the review, and if Trump loses at a trial sometime in 2026 or so. Thanks so much for being here. Hope to see you again on Talking Feds One-on-One.
All right, take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to One-on-One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. To catch the Q&A from this discussion, head over to our Patreon, where you can find other bonus content as well. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.